Hey sword fans, I am back with another video on some rare and interesting swords. Today I'm going to be talking about the least spotted of the Ethiopian sword, the scythe. And that is one of these. The Ethiopians have roughly 3 types of sword. There are also like long daggers and various others, but I'm going to concentrate on the 3 that were used by the military. They have their national sword, the shotel, which is the recurved forward. So it's a forward recurved sword with the cutting edge on the inside of the curve. Not often seen, but very interesting. They look somewhat like a khopesh, but held backwards and longer and made of steel. Then they have the guarda. The guarda is a saber. It's essentially a European saber. They have either this traditional Ethiopian hilt or they have a saber grip. And they're quite fun because they have ergonomic grips that fit around the fingers. Not something you'd often expect from a 19th century sword from East Africa. This, however, is the scythe. It is a confusing sword because it is essentially a broadsword. And originally, people believed that these had been developed from the swords of the knightly crusaders of the 12th to 15th century. But these swords developed essentially on their own. And they are a quintessential African sword, despite most of their blades, or surviving blades, being imports. What lots of people forget is that the concept of the Christian knight is not entirely Eurocentric, and the Camelot of Africa is in Ethiopia. They have had Christian knights for almost a millennia, I believe. Off the top of my head, I believe it's 12th century when they built their Christian castles and had their own version of the feudal system. And those knights carried straight-bladed double-edged swords, just like their European counterparts would. These swords were not the most popular in Ethiopia. They remained a heavy cavalry thing, much like the palash or the broadsword did in Europe. And they are rarely seen in Ethiopian art as being carried by infantry, but heavy cavalry and the bodyguards of the emperor, for sure. Today I have 2 examples to show you. One is this. This one is from around the reign of Theodore, if you're going to anglicize it, the second. He was a very interesting emperor. He tried to modernize the army and caused a rebellion amongst the tribal nobility against the new military nobility. And that war did not end well for him. The British essentially stepped in and there was colonizing going on. But always worth remembering, Ethiopia was never colonized. Occupied, yes, but never properly colonized. So this sword, to give an overview of the straight-bladed, double-edged Ethiopian scythe, an interesting point to note. Most scythes are curved. This one is just, through an odd chance of naming, has the name of a curved blade, but it is a broadsword. They have mirror-polished silver pommels usually. Horn grips, that is the lion of the emperor, the Lion of Judah, the symbol of the Ethiopian crown. This one has a wonderfully imported German blade, and it is just stunning. I absolutely love this section here. And there's just arabesque arrangements all the way up. It's a very sturdy blade as well. This is a hefty thing. And yeah, I love these. I've been looking for some, and 2 came out of one collection. I had to have them, and then as soon as I put them up for sale, they sold before they even got onto my website. They are rare, they are fun, they are very beautiful and interesting weapons that show the intersection between European militaries and African tribal nobility. And now for the second one I'm going to show you. This one, very similar to the first actually. It's a little bit bigger, so I have to step back further to show you. It is slightly later. That one dates to around 1840s. And this one is late 19th, early 20th century. This is from the reign of Menelik. And we can see that because his face is on the sword. Also, his initials. There you go. And also, there is an inscription in Amharic, the language of Ethiopia. This sword, rather than being engraved, has been etched, so you can see floral arrangements there. And this one is somewhat cruder. And during the reign of Menelik, he, rather than importing, he focused on building African items. So this one has been made with European techniques. This is wax etching. So wax paper is laid on the steel, acid is laid on the blade. Then you clean everything off and you clean up the areas that have been eaten away by the acid. But I would say this blade is definitely African. And East Africa had wonderful steel workshops. They may have imported the steel, or they may have just smelted their own, but this sword is likely African. Quick comparison with the import. So the import is slightly shorter. Well, a fair bit shorter actually. About 4 inches. This one is cuttier. This one has more presence in the point. Actually, let me stand in front of the lady so you can see. So this one wants to cut, and the long one, it has quite a lot of point control. Hopefully that translates. I'm not in my usual office space, so I can't really show you twirly-whirly stuff because the ceilings here aren't as high. And this sword, the 1840s one, it is dateable because a French French explorer and scientist called Théophile Lefebvre went on the Abyssinian expedition in 1845. No, he published his book on it in 1845. And it shows these with European Germanic engravings. Really good book. Even if your French is terrible like mine, you will have a blast looking at the illustrations. And you see almost exactly that pattern in some of the prints. So this sword from the reign of Menelik is, I would say, slightly more interesting because it has lasted. This is a sword made in Africa that at earliest it's from the 1880s, 1890s. But we know it was used up until the 1940s because this has a coin showing the face of Vittorio Emanuele III, the King of Italy, who was king when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. Mussolini invaded through Eritrea and Djibouti, and he forced capitulation from the Ethiopian military. Aside from the Christmas offensive, which was the only main success of the Ethiopians against the Italian military, it was a loss. It was a modern military fighting a East African military who were trying to compete with tactics they hadn't dealt with before. They were a modern military themselves, but they still were based around East African fighting, and at the time that was still cavalry rather than tanks, and their artillery was largely from the tail end of the 19th century, and they had their armoured vehicles or their gas-powered vehicles weren't that plentiful. There was no need for them until Europeans invaded. This sword, having that coin there, means it's likely a trophy blade. I would say, as an educated guess, cannot say this for certain, that this sword was owned by some heavy cavalryman in the Ethiopian military, potentially from the Tigray region, as they were the ones who really didn't like the Italians and carried on fighting regardless, though a good contingent of soldiers from Addis Ababa did the same. And it was likely taken during the Christmas offensive and replaced the pommel as a good luck symbol, as a screw you to the Italians who had invaded their country. And it's quite interesting because this sword was taken. Is the coin dated? No, it isn't. But this sword was a trophy weapon and carried as a symbol of good luck against a modern military less than 100 years ago. And I find that quite amazing. So, two Ethiopian swords, very similar. 100 years separate them. They went from fighting the British and other East African nations with flintlocks, percussion caps, and artillery, howitzers, to fighting the Italians who had their tanks. And they were still used and are potentially still in use today. Not something you get to see with a pair of antique swords, a current living lineage. Well, I hope you found that interesting. I will be doing more videos on African swords as I get them in. I have a nice Takuba and a couple of nice Cascara that will be getting videos soon. Hope you enjoyed, and take it easy, sword fans.